Your Partner in Success Radio is a free business podcast with host Denise Griffitts. It's all about great stories, conversation, and context to help you move your business and life forward with actionable tips and advice from her guest experts. To listen and subscribe, just find us on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you consume your podcasts.
Welcome back to Your Partner in Success Radio. I am your host, Denise Griffitts, and I'm so glad you're here. And this episode of Your Partner in Success Radio is proudly sponsored by Ben Gay III. He is a legendary sales trainer and author of the Closer series, and these books are essential reading for anyone serious about mastering the art of ethical, effective selling. And you can find his books with free shipping on eBay at Ronzoni Books, RONZONE Books. And today I'm excited to welcome my distinguished guest, Richard J. Hutto. Now, Rich, he's known as Rick, I'm going to call him Rick, has worn many hats throughout his truly remarkable career. He served as White House Appointments Secretary to the Carter family, chaired the Georgia Council for the Arts, and practiced as an attorney. And here's what really fascinates me so much. He's also an internationally recognized writer and lecturer, featured frequently on air as a historical expert, and one of his acclaimed books was even adapted for television. Now, Rick's work often explores the fascinating lives of America's Gilded Age heiresses and their marriages into European aristocracy. So today we're diving into his latest book, The Countess and the Nazis, An American Family's Private War. And this gripping story follows Muriel White. She was a woman born into privilege who chose a path of courage and sacrifice, and he'll tell you about her sacrifice, staying behind enemy lines during World War II to fight the Nazis from within. And despite her wealth being sequestered by Congress, she cared for her family and those who depended on her, meaning everybody, her family, her servants, everybody. And she ultimately paid the ultimate price to protect her loved ones. So welcome to Your Partner in Success Radio, Rick, and thank you for sending me your absolutely fascinating book. I think I've shared with you that history is one of my favorite things to read about. I've been reading about history since I was, 9-10 years old.
That's wonderful. I did the same thing. In fact, I was the nerdy little kid who was chosen to go out to the bookmobile when it came to my elementary school every week. And I would get all of the biographies in a box for me and then pull things down for my classmates and take them. So yes, I know that background very well.
Oh, listen, when I was a kid, my mom would take us and put us in the car. We lived at the library, the public library. And she would put us in there and all of us would take as many books as we could, as many as they allowed us. And we'd haul them back home. And honestly, when it was too hot to be outside because we didn't have air conditioning, we would sit in the living room with our little church lady fans, and fan ourselves and fan everybody else,
Sure.
and pass those books down.
Yeah.
And like you, I always got the biographies. I was reading about Winston Churchill when I was a kid. I was reading books like Guy de Maupassant, not necessarily historical, but great writing.
Exactly, yeah.
Fortunately, my siblings had the same taste, so we learned a lot. We were very educated for being little, kids. We really were.
That's wonderful. But my wife and I married relatively late, and so our children were born late. And so when they were little, we would take them every place. We took them to museums, we took them abroad, and we would always say to them, "You're going to remember this." And they would sort of look at us like, yeah, really. But now they admit that they did and that they enjoyed it and they learned from it. And so we just wanted them to be able to have the opportunity to see what the world had to offer.
Yeah, I love that story. And Rick, I have to tell you, your background is so unique. And my question is, how did your experiences in government and law shape your approach to writing history? There's got to be a story there.
There is actually. I'm a ninth generation Georgian, and I grew up in a very matriarchal society where the women had all the power, but they couldn't let the men know it. And so I was drawn to all of these women's stories, but I was always also drawn to public service. So in 1975, I went off to New Hampshire with a group called the Peanut Brigade. We were all volunteers for Jimmy Carter. We went up, paid our own way, paid our hotel, and we went door to door knocking. And I enjoyed it. So I kept thinking, I'll do this temporarily. I'll just campaign. And after a while, they asked me to join the formal campaign staff. And again, in my mind, I'm thinking this is all temporary until I go back to work on my master's or whatever. And of course, I never went back. I stayed in the campaign. In fact, the general election week, I was in Louisiana leading a group of peanut brigaders from the bottom of the state up to the top. But after the experience, after the unbelievable honor of serving in President Carter's White House, I then came back to Georgia to get my law degree. Turned around, went back to Washington again, practiced for a while, and then, of course, it's where I met my wife later. She had served in the Reagan White House, so we're a, you know,
You're,
bi.
you're blended. You're a blended family.
Exactly. But anyway, that's sort of a long answer to say that I was always fascinated by public service, and I was determined to go back to it. So I had to sort of move between the two. And then once we moved back to Georgia, actually, after we were married and had our first child, I was an elected member of city council for 10 years in Macon, Georgia. So even when I see these terrible things like elected officials being hunted down and even shot, I'm just horrified that we don't have the dedication to public service that we used to have a long time ago. One of my biggest regrets, in fact, from Washington, is that I had Democrats and Republicans as friends. To this day, one of my favorite friends is the widow of a Republican congressman. But my friends now tell me, who live there, you don't do that. If you even go out or seen going out to dinner with a member of the opposite party, that's a job killer right there. They just don't even talk to one another. And so I think I was there at a very good time, and I would not want to be there right now.
I think we know too much these days about our elected, I'm not going to call them leaders, but our politicians. Some of it's true, some of it's probably not true, but we form opinions based on that. And it's getting uglier by the day.
It is indeed.
It's really a shame. And listen, I'm like you. I mean, I know people from both parties. I don't have a problem with any of them. Like, why would I? I mean, we're all human. We're all people. We all have our own attitudes. Unless or until you do something that directly impacts me, we're going to get along just fine.
Exactly. Yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, I wish more people felt like that. I'm hoping that it'll calm down and people say, we are human. Yeah. Why don't we behave like we are? Exactly. But back to what we were talking about with your book, and you and I were talking in the virtual green room, history is so important. It's incredibly important. And as I noted, and I think you agreed with me, there are no new stories.
That's right. They just keep changing the characters and seeing who's on which side of the dance.
Right. That's exactly right. So what drew you to Muriel White's story? And I mean, I know you worked on this for a very long time. So how did you uncover the details of her life behind enemy lines? But before I should have asked that question next. Why did you write this book? I mean, tell me from the heart, why did you write this book?
I think that her life, Muriel's life, was so important, but it needs to be shared with people. They need to know that there were people with money and privilege who wouldn't back down even to Hitler. And I had written so much about the American heiresses who married titled husbands. And a lot of those, of course, were crass exchanges of a title for money. Hers was not that way. So when I came across her name, I started looking. And of course, you can't write something unless you have firsthand account. There has to be correspondence, photographs, journals, or something. So I went on a track to find those. And when I did, they were wonderful. 2 different places, excuse me. So I decided I'm going to see if there's enough here to write about. I then got in touch with her family. And actually, Muriel's great-grandson was incredibly helpful to me. He and I are actually going to Poland in August because he wants me to see where all of this happened. The stories in my book, they took place in Silesia, which is now Poland. So I'm looking forward to going with him and seeing firsthand where so much of this happened.
I love that story. Can you come back and share that?
Oh, I'd be glad to. Absolutely.
Okay, good. I'm a history buff. I think we've all established that. You and I were talking again in the virtual green room, and I had opened up your book to page 20, and there's a gorgeous portrait of her that was painted by John Singer Sargent, a very, very famous portrait artist back in the day. But you told me that he wasn't famous at the time. Tell me that story again.
Muriel White was one of the reasons that he became so famous. She was a brilliant woman. She was a famous beauty. And this is Muriel's mother, by the way. She decided that she wanted to be painted by
Oh,
Sargent.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was her mama.
No,
And she is gorgeous.
she is indeed, but she she had to walk up 5 flights of stairs in a dusty atelier in Paris to be painted by him. But in the middle of the process, she had to go away for a few months, and so Singer Sargent put hers aside and then painted Madame X. And of course, that was shown first, and that was what really made him popular. Right now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, there's a wonderful Sargent exhibition going on. My daughter and I were at the opening last month, and one of the paintings there is this one, the very one you're talking about, Daisy. It's beautifully framed as you walk in because it's about 7 feet high. In fact, her granddaughter, who is very much alive and witty at 103, told me that when she used to go into the dining room and that large portrait of her grandmother was there, it was intimidating because she said that let us know how we were expected to act. You can't very well mess around and play around on a dining table if you have something like that staring down at you.
I don't think I would either. I
No,
think
I
I would
agree.
use my manners.
That's right.
But it's a gorgeous portrait, and anybody who pays attention to history is familiar with the artist. So tell me again, and I want to stay out of your way because you have so much to share. So tell me, you told us why you wrote this book, but her story is so astounding. When you're writing the book, what really jumped out at you, and what was maybe one of the top two things that you felt had to be shared?
Well, the first was the fact that she had such an interesting life, and she could have just been a salonière. I mean, she could have just had cocktail parties and friends coming in and, nannies taking care of the children. She certainly had the money in the background to do that, but she didn't. She chose to be involved. When her husband was called away in the war, she had not only her family, she had 3 children, but she also had all of the employees and all of their servants, all of their families that she was responsible for. And she took that very, very seriously, so much so that she became known for sort of being the fix-it person. And what I mean by that is that when food couldn't be found, Muriel would find it for everybody. When there was some ticket to be paid, Muriel again would find the way to do that. In fact, there's a wonderful story. She was able to get an entire Jewish family out of Austria, save their lives, and get them to Australia. But what she did, and this is, you ask what was one of the most surprising things I saw researching, a lot of people know that these rich American women went over to Europe and married titled husbands. What they don't know is that Congress shut off their funds. They cut off their access to those funds. They said if this American woman is giving up her U.S. citizenship, marrying, someone that we're fighting with, we're not going to let them have any access to their funds in the U.S. And that's exactly what happened. So when it came time for Muriel to get this family, the Lauderers, and get them out of Austria, she didn't have the money. She had the contacts. She was able to get visas and that sort of thing through London, where her father had been first secretary at the U.S. Embassy for 8 years before he became ambassador to Italy and to France. But anyway, she had to ask a friend for funds. And then when they found out that once they got to Australia, they also had to have a certain amount of money in the bank. Australia, not surprisingly, didn't want to bring in people who would be wards of the state. They wanted to make sure that they could keep up their lives and sponsor themselves. So she was able to get one of her friends to put that money up. And of course, the friend rightly deserved credit. But again, it was Muriel who did all of that behind the scenes, who put it all together, and who approached her friend for those funds.
Rick, were the family ever able to get that money back? Congress
Well,
had no right to do that.
well,
Just my opinion.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Sehertosses, the family into which she married, they were Prussian nobles. They had 8 different estates to keep up. They knew, of course, that Muriel had money. And so after Muriel and her husband were married, they first went to the secondary residence because her parents-in-law were still living in the main castle. But it was a terrible place. It was called Rosenhau. No electricity, no running water. And so she paid to have every bit of that done, to bring it up to current standards, to make it a beautiful place. And she did that. But then once her mother-in-law died and she and her husband moved up to the larger house, she had to do the same thing all over again. And so all of her money that she was getting from home before it was cut off, it wasn't cut off in the first years of her marriage. It was only when the U.S. went to war as well. Um, but all of her money had been closed off after a certain time, and she was able to depend upon her father's second wife. Her mother had died by this point, and she was a granddaughter of Commodore Vanderbilt. So
Oh,
she was willing to front this money. The issue was getting it to her, though. Getting it to her behind the lines, particularly because we were at war with Germany at the time. So it was the funds that she had in her background really were not any help to her until she was paying into her husband's family's estates. And then it turned out that they were basically pocketing her money. Her father-in-law
that's no
was.
surprise. I read
Exactly.
that and I was not even a tiny bit shocked.
Yeah, exactly. They were supposed to be using it for the good of the estate and to bring it in good order. They didn't, and so she was very badly used at that point. If there's anyone in the book who comes off badly, it's her father-in-law, and I think he should. I even warned the family just before it was going to come out. They said, "Is there anything for us to worry about, any kind of scandal?" And I said, "No, other than the fact that her father-in-law was a terrible person." But in the book, as you know, Denise, there are actually audio quotes from his son saying the same thing. So in other words, I didn't have to say he was a terrible person. His own son did so.
That's a shame. And that had to have been heartbreaking for her.
Yeah,
I mean, she's
absolutely.
doing everything she can for this family, for their ancestral homes, and there's always going to be somebody in the woodpile that shouldn't be there. But just
Exactly.
I'm gonna say it.
That's right.
So her resilience is astounding. So Rick, can you share some of the ways that she managed to support everybody? I mean, you cited a couple of things, but I know there's more.
Well, there were a lot of places where there were prisoners in German camps. She was able to go and get much better treatment for them. There was one who was sent to a prison where he certainly was going to die very quickly. She was able to get him moved to a different military prisoner. But it wasn't just Americans and Germans and Brits. She did this across the board. There was a prisoner of war camp that was placed right in front of their estate, and it mainly had British pilots there. Well, 2 of them escaped. Everyone knew that she had done it, she had helped do it, but no one knew how. And at the end of the war, when the Russians invaded, they burned everything, and so there are no records. But those were British pilots that she was able to help escape, and they were never caught after that. There was another time she was at a dinner in Berlin for Tom Watson, the founder um, of IBM, and there was a dinner to honor him. She's seated at the table, and at the table is also a Nazi officer, a sort of a squad leader, if you will, plus a journalist. And so Muriel turned to the Nazi officer and said, "I understand that sometimes for meritorious service, you sometimes will allow Jews to be declared honorary Aryans. Is that true?" And he said, "Yes, it is true, as a matter of fact, although it's rare." And she came back with, "Well, then where do I go to become an honorary Jew?"
Oh,
Um, and this was said at a dinner table with a reporter, with a Nazi officer at the table. But I think her most astounding one was in the 1936 Olympics, which of course we rightly call the Nazi Olympics. She and her husband were invited to go to one of the viewing boxes at the Olympics, because he had been friends with, he was in the military, her husband, so he knew a lot of these people. Well, anyway, they're in this box, and Hitler came in himself and sat down with them and was being polite and pleasant. And she turned to him and said, "I know what you're trying to do, and I'm going to do everything to stop you." And Hitler threw his head back and said, "Oh, madam, don't be quite so serious." So she wasn't worried, obviously, about these things. I've never known whether it was a bit of hubris or whether she thought that since her father was an ambassador, her brother was an ambassador, she was married to a Prussian officer. Perhaps she thought that she had some level of protection, but that was chipped away over the years because she kept doing that kind of thing. And she finally just realized that, she's going to be a prisoner in her own house is almost what happened to her.
Let's talk about that, because what I haven't mentioned yet is that she and her husband divorced.
They did indeed. After she found out, of course, that he and his father were taking the money for things, plus he was having an affair that he was pretty open about. Um, she and he were both still living in the castle, but she went to the priest in the nearest town, which is sort of the center of their diocese, and she talked to him and she said, "Look, I'm in this terrible situation. I need my faith. I need you to tell me how I can get through this." And the priest said to her, "Ma'am, I know your husband. I will give you an immediate divorce."
Oh,
That was her husband's reputation. So she got the divorce, but then she went to the bank, the family bank, to withdraw some money, and she was told, "Oh no, you're divorced now. You cannot access any of that. Only your husband can." She had nowhere to go. I mean, there was nothing she could do. So she had the banker um, telegraph to her husband back at home and said, "Will you let her come back?" And her recently divorced husband said she can only return as an unpaid housekeeper. And that's exactly what happened in the castle that she had put the money into, that she had restored, that she had protected and supported all of the families there. She had to go back there as he said, as an unpaid housekeeper. And that was obviously not a particularly good experience for her. So she spent much of the time indoors. Even when she would go out to feed her goats, she would dress in sort of peasant clothes, if you will, to use a bad term, because she knew that there were lots and lots of SS officers and Nazi officers close around the estate.
My stomach hurts listening to this.
Exactly.
I mean, I read the book. I've read it twice, actually, and I'll read it again because I love history. But look, I understand that marriage was different back then, and I understand that a lot of these aristocratic people, I can't call them anything else,
Right.
operate differently from the rest of us.
Yeah.
But this was just unconscionably cruel, the way they treated her. Two men, the way they treated her is just not human.
Exactly. And she, of course, had no way of knowing this. But in 1941, the U.S. gave her U.S. citizenship back and sent a passport. So from 1941, she should have been able to leave at any point, but the Germans withheld it for 2 years. She didn't die until 1943. And so technically, if they had not done so, she would have been able to get out of all this, but she couldn't because of what they did to her.
Now, why was the passport sent?
Because she had been applying to get back. One of the reasons with the divorce, she was trying to get back her U.S. citizenship. Her brother he became an ambassador at the time. He was a consular official. He was helping her as well. They had people in the States helping. And so, as I said, in 1941, her passport was reissued. It was sent, but then it was confiscated by the Germans, and they would not allow her to have it.
That's, again, my stomach is hurting. So the dynamic between Muriel and her ex-husband is fascinating and heartbreaking. Can you give us some stories about, I mean, you gave us the one god-awful one, but what else happened between them?
Well, she was very much anti-Nazi because she knew the ethical and moral grounds. That was her reason. He supposedly just wanted things to go back to the way they were. In 1918, the German nobles lost their titles. He just wanted to go back to the way it was before. And if that meant having the Kaiser, if it meant having these German officers around, that was fine. So I certainly cannot call him a pro-Nazi, but I would also have to call him a lukewarm anti-Nazi. There was one evening, though, when the family was all at dinner. They had a U.S. guest sitting at the table, and there was a knock at the door, and it was the SS officers. And she said, "What do you mean coming in here and disturbing our dinner, bothering my family?" And they said, "Well, your house isn't flying the Nazi flags out front as required." And she said, "Why would we hang a flag for a party we don't support?" And this, of course, is said to Nazi officers. They started to get upset, and finally her husband just said, "Look, what do we need to do to make this go away?" And they said, "Just hang the Nazi flags here." And so they handed him over to a footman, and as they were going out, they heard Muriel say, "Fine, hang them in the hall bathroom, but make sure that they trail onto the floor."
I question her judgment a lot, but
Yep.
I love her style.
Me too as well. In fact, this one will make you think I'm a real odd duck, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I worked on over a year to try to get her book, her story told, and I just couldn't get a publisher they were interested, but they wouldn't commit. And finally, after a year of this, honest to goodness, I had a conversation with Muriel, and I said, "Look, I've done everything I can. I'm so sorry that it didn't get across the line, but I'll keep trying maybe in the future." Here's the bizarre part, and I promise you it's absolutely true. 24 hours later, I had an email from an editor at a publishing house. She had heard me give an online lecture, and she said, "Would you happen to have anything that would involve women's stories, women's history?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, can you send me a proposal?" And I said, "Yes." And I sent it the next day. And within 4 days, we had a publishing contract. So I'm convinced that Muriel did that. After I tried to sort of back out and say, "Sorry, I've done my best," she was the one, I think, who pushed it over the line. And maybe that's an odd thing to relate, but that's okay.
Listen, I think we're heard. I really do. When I say my prayers at night, when I turn my, whatever that's bugging me over to my subconscious for review at night, I'm going to have an answer at 3:18 in the morning. It doesn't matter if I went to bed at, 1 o'clock in the morning or went to sleep. I don't sleep well. I believe that we are heard, that we're not alone. And I'm not saying we've got aliens floating all over the place, but I look at Congress and I wonder.
With good reason.
I'm not joking. The Rothschilds, you can't tell me they're not related. But,
Right, exactly.
I don't believe in coincidence is what I'm really trying to say.
Yeah.
It was meant to happen as it was meant to happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, when I called her great-grandson and said this had happened, he immediately said, "Oh, Muriel did that." And
There you go.
I said, "Yes, I completely agree with you." Yeah.
Well, what does her story tell us about the expectations and limitations placed on women of her era? We're certainly not like that anymore, although I'll be very frank with you. I wish we were somewhere in the middle.
I do as well. And when I look at her background, she spoke 5 or 6 languages fluently, and then another couple conversationally. At the time she was living, the U.S. had never had a female ambassador. In fact, we didn't have one until 1949, but other countries did. So both her father and her brother were ambassadors, and I'm convinced she would have been a brilliant one herself, but that wasn't offered to women at the time. Then, of course, she goes and is the wife of this Prussian officer, and she had to operate in the shadow of him and of his family. She, as I said, had the background, the willingness, the education, and she could have done many, many more things, but she was certainly blocked in as a woman. They didn't let women do too many things back then, unfortunately. And as I said when we started, I come from a family of very, very strong women, particularly my grandmother, to whom I was devoted. And she said that to me herself. She's long dead, but she said, "Look, earlier in my life, I had to make all these things happen, but I couldn't intimidate your grandfather. He couldn't know that we were doing all these things. He had to think that he did it and that it was his idea." So I think that's part of a lot of what happened to Muriel as well.
Well, I have to ask, why did she marry this guy? I mean, I get that he was somebody quasi-important. He had a lot of property, had all this ancestral history, but why in the world did she marry him?
Well, I hate to put it this way, but she was 29, and there had been
Oh,
a lot of public statements about her not being
being
married.
on the shelf. Yeah, she
Yes,
was on the
she
shelf.
had been a
Yeah.
bridesmaid many times. In fact, at one point, the then U.S. ambassador to London came up to her at one of these receptions publicly in front of everyone and said, "Oh, Muriel, always a bridesmaid. When are you going to be a bride?" And then she had several really good possibilities that her mother tanked. Um, there was one particularly that she she was just vindictive. Her mother was in not letting her marry some of the people she wanted to. So, answer your question, at 29, she goes off to Berlin for some parties at the embassy. She met this young man. He followed her back to her home, and 3 weeks later, they were engaged. His parents had not even met him at that point. So I think a lot of that was she was saying, I'm choosing my husband. You had the opportunity for some others, and you made that not happen. So I think she was sort of saying to her mother, this is my choice and my decision. So that would have made it much, much harder once she was in the marriage to admit that she'd made a mistake, I think.
That makes sense. Why did her mom do that?
She was a famous beauty, but she was also very, very controlling.
Oh,
And at one point, she they would she was invited along with her husband, the ambassador, to a private dinner at Balmoral Castle by Queen Victoria. And while she was there, the person sitting next to her at dinner was Joseph Chamberlain, who was a member of Parliament. He had sort of come up through the manufacturing ranks. In other words, he was not from the famed background that everybody else was, but he was a brilliant man. Well, it was his son later who wanted to marry Muriel. Muriel remembered from that night of sitting next to him, and she said to her daughter, I will not let you marry that common little man from Birmingham.
oh, geez.
Yeah,
So snobbishness
exactly.
has a great deal. And, from what I've read about, and I've read a lot of history and biographies and, some that are just nonsense, but they're still fun to read. But snobbishness was a genuine thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, no question about that. And his family, Manny's family, was the same way. I mean, obviously both his parents were titled and noble, his grandparents, everybody around him, his siblings. His first cousin was the mother of the Queen Geraldine of Albania. And so they were very tied in to the Hungarian aristocracy and with the Apponese. Anyway, it was a family that was almost like an octopus because they reached into so many different areas of the country.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Queen Victoria,
Mm-hmm.
the one that had all the kids, nine
That's
kids,
Victoria.
didn't she do the same thing? I mean, she was very strategic about marrying her kids all over the world.
You're absolutely right. She made decisions based on treaties and relations
Right,
between
right,
countries, and she would tell her grandchildren where to go and what to do. The one who became the Tsarina of Russia was her granddaughter, and she had not wanted her to go there because it was a place where she thought that she wouldn't be able to withstand a lot of things, and of course that
and then
ended.
she was murdered, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Assassinated. Yeah,
There were two of her grandchildren, though, a grandson and a granddaughter, not siblings, they were cousins, but they married one another because Victoria wanted it. Their grandmother wanted them to do this, and they did. Very unhappy. So as soon as they divorced, as soon as Queen Victoria died in 1901, the grandchildren divorced and each married happily after that. So you're absolutely right.
right.
She was trying to use her family to achieve a lot of relationships across Europe.
And she did it. And didn't she also introduce a serious blood disorder?
She did indeed. Yep.
Yeah,
Hemophilia, which of course ended up not only the heir to the Russian throne, but the heir to the Spanish throne. Several other grandchildren who died because of it.
right.
She had a son who had it. In fact, probably her favorite son, her youngest, Leopold. And when he wanted to marry, when he fell in love, her first reaction was, no, 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 you can't you can't do that. We have to take care of you. You need to be sort of babied, if you will. He insisted. He was in love and he married, and it was a very, very happy marriage. But he died after his daughter was born, but before his son was even born. And it was a marriage that, as I said, Victoria had not wanted to happen, but it ended up being a happy one, at least for the short time that they had together.
She was an interesting woman, and that's all I've got to say.
Exactly.
I don't have anything rude to say. She was just an interesting woman.
She was indeed.
So, how did Muriel's American identity influence her actions and her decisions in Europe? Because from what I read and from what you've been saying, she didn't really live in America. She was really all over the world. She was kind of a jet setter.
That she was indeed. She was born in Paris, where her father was posted as a diplomat. Her brother was born in London. Of course, they came back and forth to the U.S. to visit her grandparents, but that was sort of in the future. So she knew that she had this family back in the U.S. And to go back and forth. Anyway, it was just a way that the entire family could get into diplomacy. And as I said earlier, she would have been great at it, but she wasn't allowed at the time.
That's a shame. Although, given her serious bluntness, I'm not sure how well she would do, particularly these days. I mean, you have to kind of ratchet it back and say, you can't just say to somebody, you're an ass. I don't like you. You just can't say things like that
That's
when
right.
you're trying to be diplomatic.
Exactly. That's what she had to work with and had to deal with.
Well, what lessons can today's listeners take from her courage and her selflessness?
I think the fact that each one of us can do something. We're probably not going to, help two English pilots escape. We're probably not going to speak to his face to Hitler and tell him we're going to be against him. Those are things that she did. I don't think we need to replicate those things because that would be impossible. But I think that it means that each one of us can do something, whether it's through politics, through church, through neighborhood, through families. I think she would say that that's what she learned. She took care of her family. She took care of the families of the people who worked for her. And so, particularly in the environment in which we find ourselves today, politically, I think she would say, look, I know you can't do everything, but you can do something. So go out there and do the something that you can do.
Exactly. Rick, what surprised you most during your research for this book, and how long did you research this book?
The book was about 2 years. I found a wonderful store of correspondence at Hampton, which is a National Park Service property just outside Baltimore, where Muriel's father had been born. And then the other was at the University of Georgia, wonderfully cataloged, beautifully done. And I spent several days in both of those. And then, of course, went directly to the family and was able to get some other letters and that sort of thing. But I think what surprised me the most was two things. First, I didn't realize that all of these wealthy American women had their funds cut off. I knew it to some
I didn't
degree.
either.
Yeah.
I've read about, look at the Churchill family.
Yeah, exactly.
She, a very famous beauty, married into that family, and what a mess that turned out to be.
Right.
But I didn't realize that she probably lost her money, or
Yeah.
if she even did.
Indeed, or even have access to it. So that really did surprise me. And then the other was to see that this woman, Muriel, she wasn't just doing this for Americans. She was doing it to English. There were some French soldiers that she protected and was able to get better treatment for. She did this across the board. And yes, does that mean that she helped a couple of German prisoners who were being treated badly? Yes. I don't have a problem with that. She was talking about humane treatment for a couple of these soldiers, and they were able to be given better treatment because of it. At no point, though, was she ever pro-Nazi. At no point did she buy into what Hitler was trying to do. And as I said, her husband was sort of lukewarm in that regard, but she wasn't. She was really she was the poster child, if you will, for fighting the regime. And what she finally ended up doing, she had two sons and a daughter, and the two sons she had sent off to America, to to her father to protect them because they were draftable age.
Right. They would be conscripted or drafted, or
That's right.
they would have been taken into the army.
Exactly. And she knew that. So she sent them abroad. And after a while, she kept getting told by the Nazis, and particularly by the SS, you have to bring them back. You have to produce them. And they finally gave her a deadline. They said, Madam, we're coming in X number of days. And if they are not there, you are going to Auschwitz. And that was said to her directly. And of course, Auschwitz was one of the worst concentration camps. It's not at all far from where she lived. In fact,
that's where you go to die, be killed.
Right. And I'm going to visit it in August, although I know it'll be difficult to do. But she knew that they were going to. This is what was going to happen. So one morning, she saw the car turn into her driveway, full of SS officers in uniform. Knowing that they were about to come in, they were going to torture her. She was worried about what she might give up. I don't think she was necessarily worried about death. That wasn't what would have bothered her. She would have been worried that she would give up some piece of information, perhaps, when she was tortured. Plus, who wants to go through torture anyway? So when she saw them coming up the driveway that morning, she knew what they were going to do. She climbed the tower in her castle, and she jumped to her death below.
She was protecting her children.
She was indeed, and it was the only way that she could do it. And the sort of postscript to her doing that is that her eldest son in the United States, when he learned about it, it was 4 months later, because, of course, it took so long for news like that to get around. He went and pledged allegiance to the United States, gave up his German citizenship, went for basic training at Camp Wheeler in Macon, Georgia, which just happened to be the same place my dad went through basic training. And then he was sent off to England. He wanted to go to Germany to fight, but they said, no, you are blonde, Aryan, a double-barreled name. You speak German. We're not sending you to Germany. You would not last very long. So they sent him instead to England and had him interview captured German soldiers to try to get what information he could, some of whom he knew, of course. They, of course, would spit in his face and call him a traitor. But that was as close as he could get. England, his mother having, of course, been in Silesia. But he was just determined that this is the way that he could make this happen. He could do something to avenge his mother's death.
And the second son?
Since he was the younger son, he was not as involved in so many of these things. All he ever wanted, truthfully, was a ranch out in the West. That's what he wanted.
See, I understand that.
Yeah, from the time he was little. And guess what? He got it. Jackson Hole, Wyoming. He ended up having a ranch there. And he's now deceased, but his son still manages that place as well. So since he was not at all political, but again, he was saved by his mother, and he even served later in the United States Army as well, somewhat briefly.
And how about the daughter?
Margaret, a brilliant woman. She was the firstborn. She was the one who went back and forth to the U.S., to her grandparents and to her parents back in Silesia. She did things like giving a full solo concert at Carnegie Hall, singing classical music. And yet at the same time, she was winning, mixed double tennis tournaments. She ended up having 3 sons, and one of those sons, who is very much still alive, was very helpful to me. And it's his son, Paul, who is the one that, as I said, I'm going over with in August.
I'm almost speechless. It seems like she somehow managed, without the assistance of her husband,
Right.
I'm air quoting POS husband.
Right.
I just am. But it seems like she managed to raise some pretty remarkable people despite everything that was going on in her life and in the world.
She did. And one of the things you asked earlier, what surprised me, and I only gave you one of the two, this one is the other. Even after they were divorced, they were living in that house and she was still taking care of him. He was supposed to go up. He had been out on medical deferment. He was supposed to go back to combat. She, after all he had done to her, she hid him in a hay wagon, packed it with food, gave gave one of the servants on the place orders to drive him, and so he was able to get away by being driven overnight over a mountain. And so she was even getting him protected then after the way he had treated her. And I remember going, "Good Lord, this has to be coming from some place that I just can't fathom."
I can't fathom it either. I would have just said, "See ya."
Yeah, and
I would not have helped him.
one quote: the servant who drove him, later said that when he went, he took he took one or two little things, and I'm quoting here, 11 pairs of shoes because he really liked shoes.
Oh,
And of course,
did I say POS? I meant it.
exactly. I mean, can you imagine after what he's done to her, she puts him in this hay wagon and protects him and gets him to escape. And he did. He lived long after the war, and lived in a house that she and her money had paid for.
Nice guy.
Yeah, very.
I mean, and I understand he's probably a product of his upbringing, but dang, not a good human being at all.
Not at all. And I'm glad to say that the descendants are like her and not like him.
That's what I was trying to get at.
They're really, really nice people. They just gone out of their way to help me. I was even snowed in one day, way up just outside Albany, New York, and I had to get out. And there was no Uber, nothing would go because there was a huge snowstorm. Margaret's grandson, Alan, who was in his 80s then, came and drove to where I was and drove me through all the roads to get me to the airport up in Albany, New York. And of course, I tried to give him something or pay or whatever. He said, "Of course not." Who else in their 80s would have done something like that? So that is to say that yes, the family members have followed her lead and not his.
It's amazing. You have written extensively about Gilded Age heiresses. So how does Muriel's story compare to others that you've researched? I mean, this is a fascinating story in a gut-gripping way. I'm going to tell everybody, get the book. It's a beautiful book. It's hard to read sometimes, but we need to understand what has happened and where this is all coming from.
Exactly. Particularly when you start reading about, the freedom of the press being curtailed as the Nazis were rising. It's difficult not to make comparisons to some of the things that happen in this country and the division. In Silesia where they lived, there were 3 wars called the Great Silesian Uprisings, and these were just people slaughtering one another. And that
so nothing new.
Exactly. And that
listen, if we don't understand our history or at least take a peek at it, we're not going to understand what's happening now.
Absolutely.
Okay, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. Muriel, though, ended up, I mentioned the Silesian uprisings. Her father was one of 5 U.S. signatories to the Versailles Peace Treaty at the end of the war, and he was a peacemaker. In fact, on his grave in the National Cathedral in Washington, it has the beatitude, "Blessed are the peacemakers." But he sort of built into his daughter, I guess, these beliefs, these principles, whatever, that would guide her. But he also was a close friend of Woodrow Wilson, who appointed him as one of those 5 signatories. And Wilson personally said to Muriel at one point, "They had lied to me about what was happening in Silesia until you told your father and your father told me." So in that regard, she directly affected U.S. Foreign policy by working through her father, and then he, of course, with his good friend Woodrow Wilson. This was a woman of many, many talents, and that's why I was determined that her story should be told.
Now, isn't Woodrow Wilson kind of widely known as one of the worst presidents we've had? Or am I thinking of someone else?
It's probably someone else. Wilson was the person who wanted what became the United Nations to come about. It was an earlier incarnation of it, but he really was sort of a peacemaker. There were several bad presidents, though, during the period roughly that you're talking about.
Yeah, now I'm going to have to go on a hunt because I know there's one that people just go, "Oh, ick." Of course, we've got our
Rutherford Hayes, perhaps.
Maybe so. That doesn't sound right to me, though. But I'm going to go hunt, and of course, now we've got current presidents that were like, I don't know about you, but that's just the way life is. We go through these cycles, and
Well, you would appreciate that in January for President Carter's funeral, we had to be, of course, in the National Cathedral way before it would start because of all the security. And every living U.S. president came, and
right.
every living U.S. First Lady except Michelle Obama, for very good reason. But anyway, it was so bizarre to sit there and think about all of these men, and they were all men since they've all been presidents, sitting there in that front row. And I kept wondering what would President Carter had said to them. Some of them would not have liked it because he never tried to sugarcoat anything. But it was just interesting to be in the presence of all of those people, all of those presidents and vice presidents who were also seated right behind in the next row.
He did live a long, long life.
He
And you
did.
have to admire, his public service, what he did with Habitat for Humanity. I mean, he accomplished some very remarkable things during his life.
He did indeed, and he was proud of them. And at first, it bothered him that people would say, well, he was the best ex-president. And he would say, well, I think I was a pretty good president as well. But he obviously came to honor that belief, that opinion that people had of him. And he deserved every bit of it. I have to admit to you, though, that after Mrs. Carter died, and she was my former boss, I thought he would go very quickly because they were so close. They'd been
I
married.
did too. I was surprised that he
Yep.
lingered on. Honestly, I had an ongoing bet with myself. A week, he's going to be gone in a week.
Yeah.
And then the
I,
next week he was still there.
I know, and I remember thinking exactly the same thing. And so, at one point toward the end of his life, I asked the president's son, you know, how he's hung on all this time. And I'm just quoting him, so don't be upset with me for being political. But he said that his dad was determined to live long enough to vote for Kamala Harris for president,
Yeah.
and he did. So he lived several weeks beyond that as well.
I was always a bit puzzled by that because there was a point where a son or a grandson said that he was basically non-responsive. So I always wondered if he was non-responsive, how could he be voting? But that's a whole nother question.
Well,
Well, Rick,
you should know so that nobody worries. He slept a lot, but when
okay.
he was awake, he was absolutely spot on. There was never any issue with memory loss or anything like that.
Oh,
He
okay.
he would sit in his lounger chair in their house in Plains, and he might sleep for 3 hours, but then he'd wake up for an hour or two and talk to the family members. There was always a family member there, always a child or a grandchild there with him the whole time.
He did have a loving family.
He
No
did.
question about that. Rick, thank you so much for being with us here today to share Muriel White's extraordinary story. And your work continues to shed light on the hidden acts of courage that shaped history. So here's my question. What's next for you? Do you have another book coming up? What's going on?
My publisher actually, when they bought this book, they bought first right of refusal for my next one. So they've just recently exercised that right. They bought my next one, but part of the contract is I can't say what it's about. But I will tell you.
Oh,
But I can say that it's still
darn it.
in the Gilded Age. It's very, very high Gilded Age, and we'll leave it at that. And then maybe once that one comes out, you'll let me come back on and tell you about it.
Are you kidding? I was just going to tell you, you have to come back. That's not even a question. I'm ordering you to come back.
I'd love to.
I would love to have you come back. This book is amazing, and I really do want people to pay attention to it. So here's what I need for you to tell our audience. Where can they connect you with you, and where can they find your work?
Well, for this book, www.thecountess.net. Just the Countess, all one word, .net. And then on that, there's a link to about 4 or 5 different places, not just Amazon, but other places that you might want to purchase as well. You can do it directly from there. And so that, as I said, is thecountess.net. And if they're interested in my other books, my magazine articles, all that sort of thing, it's just rickhutto.com. Pretty easy there. One that I could, I guess, easily remember is my dottage. But if they can go there and see any of my other things as well.
Rick, thank you so much. It has been a genuine pleasure chatting with you. And again, thank you for the book. I think I've shared this with you. I have hundreds of books in this room. Every single book in this room, which is my office, came from guests like you. Every single one I've read, I've reviewed, and they're I have a bookcase that's closest to my desk. Those are the books that I go back to over and over again. When this comes off of my desk, as soon as we're through today, it's going back on that shelf or I can see it. It's an
Great.
amazing book. So
Thank you.
listen, oh, my pleasure. So listen, everybody, today's episode of Your Partner in Success Radio featured Richard J. Hutto, Rick Hutto. He is a distinguished author and historian who shares the incredible true story behind his book, The Countess and the Nazis, An American Family's Private War. We explored the courageous life of Muriel White, an American heiress who risked everything, including her life, to fight the Nazis from within enemy lines during World War II. And Rick's deep knowledge of history and captivating storytelling bring this remarkable tale to life. So if you're inspired by stories of bravery and sacrifice and history, don't miss this conversation. So to connect with Rick or learn more about his work, reach out to him at rick@rickhutto.com or go to his website, rickhutto.com. Rick, thank you so much.
Thank you, Denise. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Me too. And I'm looking forward to having you back when the new book is ready.
Terrific. I'll look forward to it as well.
Okay, bye.
Get your voice heard. If you would like to launch your own far-reaching podcast, contact Denise Griffitts at yourofficeontheweb.com and go to the podcast tab.